Hey everyone, welcome to Hard Things About Product, our April edition. It's interesting how I bumped into Rajesh. So recently I had a block, and maybe the term is what they call this is a writer's block. And similar to that, I had this thing of vision block, and I was trying to set a vision. It was like I couldn't just anchor myself on what I wanted to do in a very satisfactory way. So I was on a quest, if you will, just going out and finding how do you really craft good vision. And then what happened was that there are so many different variations of doing it. Some people feel that it needs to be extremely real, near term. Some people feel like it needs to be far out, inspiring. So there are a lot of theories out there. And as I kept exploring, something dawned on to me. Each of us, no matter what role we play, whether you're a product manager, designer, tech lead, or a senior leader in the organization, I feel like this practice of having vision is or creating crafting vision is something that is never encouraged from bottom up. And suddenly one fine day when you're a leader and when you're tasked with setting a vision and that to inspiring, real, and what have you, it's not an easy thing to come by. Similar to what you have heard about, this taking is a habit. I strongly believe crafting vision is a habit as well. And as you rise up at a feature level, at an opportunity level, at a portfolio level, you will then start crafting visions in a much effective way. And in order to do this, I was actually in search of what is going to really work. And then I bumped into Rajesh's framework. I can't tell you, I just fell in love with that. And what he does really well is work backwards from the customer. And I'll not steal the thunder, so I'll let him walk his techniques. But look, I think this was one thing that I found extremely simple, beautiful, and extremely powerful if we can practice this over a period of time. And the moment I chanced upon that, I said, Rajesh, yes, APAC community will benefit from this. And I could wait no longer to bring him to have a chat with our audience. So without further ado, Rajesh, the floor is yours. We're all eagerly waiting to learn from you as to how we can craft vision.
Awesome. Thank you, Vivek, so much for the background and for having me tonight, or I guess this morning for y'all. Very, very excited to be here today. So I've got kind of a jam-packed agenda. I wanted to do a brief intro about myself, talk about the framework itself, and then we'll get into the meat of this, which is the components that lead up to building a vision and then a strategy to realize it. So we'll start with personas and key outcomes, which is a part of the framework, talk about what a customer journey vision looks like, working backwards to create a strategic plan. I'm going to talk about balanced road mapping, not because it was part of the topic today, because it's a little bit more of a tactical thing, which is like, it's not that helpful to have a vision if you don't know how to like balance that against like everything else that's near term that you have to like juggle. And then we'll do a case study. It's an imaginary product that we use to kind of illustrate the concepts. And we'll have some time for questions along the way. So if you do have any, just throw them in the chat and I'll do my best to try to get to them. I'm also happy to stick around for like 15 or 20 minutes after the talk on Zoom and answer questions if anyone's free. So with that, I'm going to just give you all a little bit about my background. So we were chatting. I'm a Texan. I grew up in Dallas. I went to college at UT Austin and did electrical engineering. And then I went to go work at Accenture for 5 years after college. And I started as a software engineer and architect, but found myself quickly drawn to the business side of things. And so I became a business analyst, and that was my first step into the world of product. So I've been doing it for more than 15 years now, but wasn't sure about kind of consulting as the right long-term path for me. So I went to business school up at Michigan Ross, and I used that to transition into the world of startups. So my first year, I worked for a student-run company called Hitchers that got acquired after we graduated in the travel space. And my second year, I started a company called TerraPerks to encourage people to become more sustainable. And our first product was this Facebook app that lets you compare your energy usage to your friends and family to see who was the most efficient. And so I spent about 1.5 years trying to sell that to utility companies and home energy professionals. And then I got engaged and realized I needed a salary. And so I moved out to Washington, D.C., and I joined a growth stage startup called Opower that was doing something very similar. Opower went public about 7 years ago. So I was there kind of pre-IPO, seeing a lot of the explosive growth and all the product challenges that come with it. I found myself drawn kind of a little bit more to the consumer side of things. At Opower, I was working on some internal tools. And so I went to a fintech called Hello Wallet in the DC area. As a senior product manager, we got acquired about a year after I joined. And so I ran product for a year after the acquisition. And then the company that bought us was Morningstar up in Chicago. And so they asked me to move out there and take over a $40 million product portfolio with a team of about 20 people. So I did that for a couple of years. And while I was out in Chicago, I realized that I kind of missed the world of startups. Morningstar was a slightly bigger company. So I started advising on the side at 1871, and I really enjoyed it. And so when we decided to move closer to friends and family about 4 years ago, I moved back to Austin, and I left Morningstar and became a product advisor and coach. And I did that by reconnecting with Ben Foster, who co-authored this book with me. And he was the head of product and design when I was at Opower. He basically retired the day of the IPO about 7 years ago and started doing some ad hoc kind of coaching, advising work. And so collectively, we've worked with about 75 companies over the past 7 years. And it's mostly startups, some growth stage companies, and a few enterprise clients. I've worked with about 30, including Savonics, which where Pin is at, and based in Singapore. And what we realized as we were watching, kind of seeing what the product teams were struggling with at all these different companies is a bunch of patterns. And so a couple of years ago, we kind of packaged all of our best practices into a framework that we called Vision-Led Product Management. And then last year we wrote the book on it. And so I wanted to provide a quick overview of the framework before we do a deep dive into how to use it to actually set your vision. And in order to do that, we're going to do a quick exercise. So if you're willing to, turn your video on, because we're going to be raising hands and then putting them down. If you don't want to turn your video on, no problem. Just use the Zoom reactions, and I'll kind of flip through the screen and engage reactions here. But imagine for a second that y'all are down here in Texas with me. You're in Austin, it's the capital. We've got some good barbecue. We've got an American football team that is not very good, but they should be. And we've got decent weather for the most part. I don't think it's as good as Singapore, but it's usually warm here. Okay, so imagine that we're all standing in downtown and a bus pulls up. How many of you would get onto that bus if you had no idea where that bus was going? Okay, no one. That's actually the first time I think that's happened. Okay, let me change the question up for y'all. What if I told you that you were here in Austin, Texas with me, and the bus was going to San Francisco to California? How many of you want to get on the bus if it was going from Austin to California? Okay, some people raising their hands. All right, that's great. Okay, put your hands back down. What if I told you it was going from Austin to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, on the East Coast? How many of you would want to get on that bus? Okay, I see some thumbs up, some different people, some hands going down, all good. Let me complicate things a little bit more. For those of you who said, San Francisco was interesting, let me add a little wrinkle. What if I told you that the trip from Austin to San Francisco was going to be an outdoor adventure? Every night we were going to stop at a national park and we were going to go camping and hiking. How many of you would want to get onto that bus? Okay, I see a lot more hands. All right, see all the outdoorsmen, all the outdoors folks are coming out. Okay, flip it a little bit more. From Austin to Washington, D.C. What if it was the City Slicker tour? We were going to stop at some really nice restaurants and museums and see all the landmarks, some cocktail lounges. How many of you would want to get onto that bus? All right, some different people. I see lots of hands going up and down. Thank you all for participating. Let me bring it back home. Why am I talking about buses and road trips here in the US? Imagine for a second that the bus is your product, that the passengers are your customers and your stakeholders. That final destination is your product vision. That route, the cities you're going to stop in along the way, is your product strategy. And that the daily itinerary from city A to city B is your product roadmap. These are the key concepts that we use to explain the concept of vision-led product management. And if I was going to kind of like build on the road trip analogy, and you had this sort of fork in the road, It's exactly this, which is that if you don't know where you're going, everything seems like it could be a good idea. But that sense of direction is what helps you say, no, we need to go right because we were trying to go that generally in that direction. If we go left, we're going to be taking a detour, right? But if you don't have that end state defined, it becomes a lot harder to say no to things and know whether you're actually making a good choice. So let me provide a quick overview of like how we relate that road trip analogy back into the sort of like vision-led product management framework. Of course, like most product management sort of skills, this is all about forward-looking thoughts of where we're headed. And in the same way that when you're on a road trip, you can go look at the sort of odometer on the bus and know that we've traveled, so many kilometers and okay, I've made progress. We were supposed to go, 1,000, we've gone 500. We ask teams to first start with the customer outcome as the metric of progress. Notice how this isn't the business outcome. Every team knows what their business outcome is, right? It's something with a dollar sign in front of it. But that dollar sign is usually a lagging indicator of whether you're delivering value to your customers. And so this creates a focus on what customers are trying to accomplish, and we'll do a deep dive on what this means. From there, we ask teams to think about what is an end state vision that would 10x that outcome for your customers at some point in the future. What is the experience you want to deliver to your customers that would really be game-changing from their perspective? And once you have that future vision, then we ask teams to work backwards to create what we call the strategic plan. These milestones with milestones along the way. Again, these are like the cities that you might stop in along the way. From Austin to Washington, D.C., we might go through New Orleans and then Nashville, Tennessee, and then end up in Washington, D.C. It's helpful to know that along the way. And then a roadmap is really kind of the details of how you get from milestone 1 to milestone 2. In the road trip analogy, this would be the equivalent of saying that, hey, the bus is going to leave at 8 a.m. At 12 o'clock, we're going to stop at this really nice restaurant. At 4 o'clock, we're going to get coffee at this coffee shop that overlooks, this river. And then at 7 o'clock, we're going to stop at dinner at this restaurant, and the hotel is a mile away from there, right? Those are the details, sort of like, well, how are you going to get from city 1 to city 2? And so for tonight, I want to start with one of the most important foundational pieces here, which is really around target personas and key outcomes. And I'm gonna sorry, let me just see if there's any questions here. I realized that the chat went away when I turned on the, okay, good. All right, these chats are all about the road trip, cool. So one of the foundational elements in our process, and this is sort of what how our process unfolds, is we ask teams to identify those key outcomes, envision what they want their customer journey to look like to really move the needle on those outcomes or the customer outcome, then work backwards to create a product strategy, build a balanced roadmap by prioritizing long-term needs with near-term needs, and then go execute. So we'll go through these first 4 steps tonight. We won't get into roadmap execution. That's a whole nother talk that I have. That's like a separate set of lessons learned and best practices. So today, to start with, I'm going to start with this identified step. And in order to explain how do you identify these key outcomes, I want to sort of compare and contrast how a sales-driven business would deliver value to how a product-driven business would deliver value. So imagine for a second that this circle represents a market of customers, and every blue dot is an individual customer and what they need and what they want. At the sales-driven organization, they build a custom solution for every single customer, right? I worked at Accenture for a long time as a consultant. I knew that our partners, their job was to say yes. Anything the government clients wanted, we would build it. No problem. It'll cost you something, but we'll build it, right? It'll all have a custom solution for every single government client that we worked with. Let me contrast that with how a product-driven company would think about delivering value. And remember, at the product-driven company, they're thinking about scalability. They don't want to build custom solutions for everyone. So what that means is that they need to start thinking about how to cluster some of these customers together. And imagine that this is sort of they clustered this group of green dots, and this is what they call that product win zone, right? Right now, this group of folks seems to get value out of our product. It's resonating with them. They like it. It's better than alternative solutions. I'm going to put a name to these people, right? And I'm going to call them, there's something common between them. I'm just going to call them persona A for now. Then the question becomes, okay, this is cool. Like, this group of people seems to like us. How do we grow our business? And at the product-driven company, what they would probably do is say, okay, I'm going to look outside of where we're already winning and think about how I can grow in an area outside of that. Imagine that this is called the product growth zone. and they think about all these orange dots and say, okay, there's something common about these orange dots as well. Let's call them persona B. All right, so that still leaves all these blue dots outside of the gray box. I'm going to turn them red for a second, and I'm actually going to call them persona see you later. These are the customers for whom the product was never designed. They're never going to be happy. It wasn't built for them. And guess what? I've been there. Every company does this, right? You sell to that one early customer who you thought was going to be a good fit, and then they just sit outside of your sort of sweet spot and your target market. They're the loudest, they complain the most. Customer success is always asking you what to do about them, right? And at some point it becomes hard, but you have to say no, right? Of course, it's really easy for me to stand up here and put a bunch of dots on the screen and draw boxes around it. But in the real world, how do you draw boxes around, how do you identify these commonalities so that you can then say, this group of people have some similar needs? I think there's kind of two main things that help cluster dots together. One is what we're going to talk about in a minute is key outcomes. There must be some commonality in what they're trying to achieve from your product, right? And then secondly, there must be some commonalities in the evaluation criteria that they're using. If I was going to kind of use an analogy here, every car can get you from point A to point B. So like, let's say the key outcome was just like, hey, get me to point A to point B. But if that were true, then why are there 45 different car brands out there and like infinite number of models, right? It's because price point and the reason I get a Jeep instead of a Tesla is because I want to be able to go off-road. I have a family, and so safety matters a lot to me. I don't have a family. I don't care that much about safety, right? All these factors help you create some of the commonalities and clusters that are relevant for creating the product for a group of people, right? So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit and do a deep dive on this concept of a key outcome. Effectively, a key outcome is an end goal that a person wants to accomplish because it's important in their life. And this is taking a step back from just, in order to answer this question of what is the key outcome for a given customer, it requires a lot of customer discovery. Obviously, we use the framework ourselves for our business at Prodify. I was just on a call this morning, actually, with a former client, trying to suss out what were the success metrics? What did success mean for him? How did he know if we were doing a good job as product advisors and coaches, right? It's not easy, but it requires, but kind of doing that customer discovery helps illuminate what are the things that matter to these folks and what does success actually mean to them so that you can make sure your product is always moving the needle in that dimension for them. So we also use a pyramid structure. And so I wanted to explain the idea of key outcome pyramids, which is one part of the framework. The general idea is that at the top of the pyramid is that key outcome, the thing that your customer or in some cases user wants to accomplish and that matters to them in their life. From there, you can break that down into constituent parts. It's almost like a math equation, and we'll go through an example here in a minute to help illustrate this. And as the pyramid grows, then at the bottom, you can connect the dots between product usage and your logins and your feature usage and all those things, so that as you move up the ladder or the pyramid, you can clearly see how value is being created for your customers and your users through product usage. And there's another key point about pyramids, which is at the bottom of the pyramid, the metrics probably change pretty fast, but at the top of the pyramid, they probably don't change as fast. And so there's sort of this idea of leading indicators versus lagging indicators. So let me provide a little bit more context on why this framework is helpful and why we think it'll work. Number one, it focuses on what matters to the personas you serve, right? Their goal, what is at the top of their list? What matters more than anything else and why? Two, it shows you the relationship between KPIs. I can't tell you how many like SaaS dashboards I've seen that just have all these like metrics that are moving in all different directions. And when I ask the product team what they do with it, they sometimes just kind of shrug and they're like, actually, we don't know. Sometimes we don't know which metric matters. The pyramid forces you to establish the relationship between leading indicators and lagging indicators. A pyramid also allows you to create focus and almost assign certain pillars of value creation, right? So if you can separate the product metrics and identify what are the features that drive value in different dimensions for customers, now, for those of you who have read sort of Marty Kagan's Empowered, this is what he means by empowered, right? You can hand product success metrics off to individual teams and product managers and ask them to go move the needle on them, right? Finally, it limits the number of metrics. I have seen dashboards that are no joke, probably 30 or 35 metrics, and it's a lot. It's a lot. If you imagined, I haven't actually run the math here, right? But imagine it took 20 hours a month to like go get the data to calculate a metric, run the numbers, double check the numbers, answer all the questions that come along there, present them to your stakeholders, and then like maintain it in a dashboard. It's not easy to like maintain these metrics. And so if you can manage it, kind of limit it to a finite number, it becomes a lot more manageable, especially at a startup. Um, so that's sort of the concept behind key outcome pyramids. Let me go through this one example just as, and this is for a B2B product. The key outcome is ROI in the B2B sense, right? And how does ROI break down? Am I getting more benefits than the cost of the product? And if you thought about how benefits would break down in the B2B space, I think you could simplify it to a couple main things, right? Is a product designed to generate more revenue for me or reduce cost? And if you broke revenue down further, you might think of it as, hey, is this product going to help me land new customers, or is it going to help me retain or expand my relationships with existing customers? On the cost reduction side, is it saving me time? Is it saving me actual cost? Maybe a little bit of both. You can imagine how productivity software and things like that might fall into this bucket. And then coming back to the sort of like cost side of the equation, there's direct costs and indirect costs. The direct costs are, hey, we have a SaaS product, we charge a licensing fee, and that's how much it costs. Maybe there's some service fees that some companies charge for customizations or, white glove customer support, those types of things. And then one that I think a lot of teams forget about in the B2B space is sort of the indirect costs of managing a B2B product, right? How long is it going to take my employees to like learn this product, and how long does it take them to use the product on a regular basis? So with that, I'll pause here and just see if there's any questions about the idea of customer outcomes or key outcome pyramids. Again, this is part of the foundational work to create the customer-centric focus that's needed to craft the vision for your customers.
Like we're going good.
Okay, cool. No problem. I'll pause again in a minute to ask additional. If anyone has any questions, throw them in the chat. I'm watching it. Okay, let's talk about a vision. Just as a kind of quick context reminder, now we're kind of moving into the second step of the vision-led framework. This step is all about 10xing the outcome metric. And before I get into the vision concept itself, let me talk a little bit about why we use this phrase 10x. Like, we don't literally mean that you sort of like deliver 10 times more value than the competitors or anything like that. What we mean is we just want teams to think boldly. So let me just like draw some charts here for you. Imagine that you've got revenue over time. And this orange line sort of represents effectively your TAM, right? This is the maximum amount of money we could get if we close like every single deal for every single customer in our target audience. Well, the reality is you're not going to close every deal. So then you have this actual revenue, right? And the gap between sort of the potential and the actual is missed revenue. And what we see is that most product teams spend most of their time here trying to fill this gap. How do we close more deals? How do we win more deals? And that's great. But at the end of the day, look at how this is sort of an asymptote to the maximum value that you're delivering to your business, right? You're never really going to get that much past the dotted orange line. And instead, what we see is an opportunity to think instead about, how do I actually get this orange line to be much bigger? And how do I maximize the amount of value that I can create and create expansion and the ability to grow our market and our target audience, and that by creating more value for our customers? Then if you assume that you're still not going to close all your deals, this is what we would call a product-driven kind of team. And I think the idea here is that at a product-driven organization, product is 1 or 2 years ahead of sales and marketing. Their job is not to help sales close their, hit their numbers this quarter. Their job is to help sales sign up for numbers next year that sales today would have thought were unfathomable, impossible, right? And they can only do that by being well ahead of the rest of the company and thinking about what the future of the product and the market and the customer needs are. And so if they're doing that, then let's look at what happens to this company. They still don't even come close to capturing all the value that was potential. But look at how much better off they ended up here than they would have if they had just stayed with the existing product suite. So that's the reason we talk about this 10x outcome. It helps create bold visions. And so with that, I'm going to use that as the framework. And this is the framework we ask teams to think about. You know what matters to your customer. Now think about what type of experience you want to deliver that helps them 10x that sort of outcome, right? And this is a little diagram that I created to help illustrate the different types of vision, product vision artifacts I've seen. And kind of on the x-axis, you've got very verbal to very visual artifacts. And on the y-axis, you got a lot of detail, or sorry, just high level to really, really, really detailed. And I'll be honest, any of these are good because what I've seen at lots of companies when we've met them is all of this is communicated verbally and it's folklore. So the idea of just getting it down on paper is a really good starting point. Now you'll notice that I've starred a couple of these sort of ways up in the top right quadrant here, the customer journey comic strip and mockups. We're going to look at an example of this in a minute, but we have a strong preference for highly visual but detailed vision artifacts. And the reason is the visuals, a vision is intended to inspire the audience who's seeing it, right? If you give them a 40-page Word document or Google Doc, it's probably not going to get read and it's probably not going to be inspiring. And so the visuals helps simplify it in a way that someone could digest it in 30 seconds or a minute. And that's important if you're trying to get buy-in for your vision and get people excited about it, right? The other reason we like details is sometimes we see short, something like a product positioning statement that leaves so many open questions and interpretations that everyone in their head has a different version of what that means. And then everything they do kind of fits into that category. And everyone thinks they're aligned, but when you get down into the details of what it means to sales or marketing or product or engineering, everyone's got a different interpretation. So I'm going to do some details here on what we mean by sort of the customer journey. And the general idea is to explain what you want your customer experience to look like at some point in the future. And we have a few different chapters. These chapters start at a triggering moment, right? This is when the customer or the buyer is so frustrated with their existing solution, they're banging their head against the wall and just thinking, man, there must be a better way of doing this. And that's when it moves into more of the discovery phase where maybe they'll start doing some research and thinking about what are the other options that are out there, right? And along the way, they're doing some sort of like rapid fire evaluation, or maybe, obviously in a B2B context, they're doing a much more rigorous evaluation of whether your product looks like it could be better than whatever their existing solution is. Hopefully that leads to a trial. And we use this phrase kind of generically. We don't just mean like, oh, I have a free trial. This could also be like a pilot in the B2B context, but it's a chance for them to kick the tires on the product and see if it's actually better than what they're doing before. And then that leads into ongoing usage. This is where a lot of product teams spend their time, right? How do we get people engaged and retained and activated and things during onboarding, all those things. And the reality is all this comes full cycle, because at some point your customer or your user might have a chance to drop off and just go use another product. And when push comes to shove, have you thought about how you're going to retain those customers and make sure that they're there? So I wanted to offer a few tactical tips, kind of like jumping from theory now a little bit more into sort of like tactical ideas. I wouldn't start trying to craft a vision if you don't have alignment on the persona and key outcomes. I'll say this, like everything with product leadership, the framework was intended to help drive alignment from the top down or from the bottom up. Because when there's not alignment, that's when all the churn and debates about prioritization and roadmap happen. And it's typically because, hey, people have different ways that they're keeping score of what product success means, right? So the idea here is to make sure that you're starting with, the personas and the key outcomes and getting alignment on those. The time horizon is actually really important. I would say for most people, you may want to start with 3 to 5 years just as a starting point. Again, as Vivek was saying, you can apply these concepts at the feature level and start with a 12-month horizon or a 6-month horizon to start getting practice about crafting a vision. But when you're talking about a full product or a portfolio, it's typically a 3 to 5 year horizon. And part of the reason for that is because you want it to be bold, right? If it's something that's going to happen in the next few months, like it's not that exciting or inspiring. It's also not that clarifying, because everyone probably has a pretty good sense of what needs to happen in the next few months. Where all the uncertainty and clarity needs to come from is what happens after that, right? So you want to make it bold, but also feasible. By feasible, what we mean is make sure that it could fit into a 3 to 5 year time horizon. Don't just assume that it would. Go do some t-shirt sizing as you kind of work through it. Again, consider every chapter of the journey. Don't just focus on, registration and login, or, logging back in the second time, those types of things. And in order to help inform it, talk to some of your forward-thinking customers, or maybe even your prospects. And I think that prospects, we kind of included that here just because a lot of times the vision is intended to help communicate how the company is going to grow. And that company growth often happens by expanding beyond the existing user base, right? Well, in order to do that, you have to have a good sense of what your, some other group of people want and need. And so I think talking to prospects is an important part of this. Document it, like we talked about. I think right now in the pandemic, written communication is really critical, and having an artifact that people can reference, even if you start off really simple and just have stick figures or some captions to start with for a comic strip, that's great. As you're doing this, you're going to have a lot of open questions, and you might have to highlight certain parts of your vision, artifacts, and use those open questions to create almost a backlog for your discovery interviews. Wow, we have a lot of questions around this area. We better go do some, some customer discovery or research in the next, few weeks. And the last thing I'll just offer here is to validate the vision externally before you bring it internal. The general idea here is you want to make sure that the vision is informed and validated by customers and users and prospects before the internal stakeholders put their own perspective on it. Okay, let me pause there. I know I covered a lot, and then I also cut off halfway through there. So let me see if anyone has any questions before we jump into the next phase, which is you've got the outcome metric, you've got the vision, and now you're going to work backwards with the strategic plan.
Rajesh, there seems to be one question on chat. Malika, I didn't know Malika was here. Malika had strategy for us, so just FYI. So she's dropped this question: should you use consumer research or behavioral data to set up or validate your personas? Should you also try to identify persona C who don't benefit from your product?
So I guess yes to all of this. Let me just answer the second question, because I think it's the most common one that I get. It was how do you build personas? The reality is it takes a while. There's a lot of research that goes into them. What I would recommend is to start super high level. If you thought about how a sculptor might actually start their sculpture, right? They usually chisel out a rough pass of what they want the end state sculpture to look like, and then they start refining it and refining it and refining it, and finally start looking like that end state. I would say start with, if you have a B2B to C product, start with your buyer persona and your user persona, and just say look, we at least recognize that we've got a buyer and a user that we need to sort of reconcile with. As you get further along and you start doing more research, maybe you can break the buyer persona into 2 separate ones and be actually, now we realize that there's 2 different types of buyers, and we need to make the strategic decision of who's the one we're going to go after and why, and then who's not, right? So I think personas, just like the product, are agile artifacts that kind of evolve over time, but having some foundational starting point is helpful in this type of strategic planning process. So Swati, great question. How do you validate it externally? So yes, I would actually think about how could you communicate, maybe not the entire vision document or ideas to customers, but listen, if you don't have their buy-in, then guess what happens, especially with B2B sales? The lack of the vision is what creates sort of the vacuum in which they just send the random feature request, right? And it's because they have no sense of what your direction is for your product, and they don't see it getting better in the dimensions that they want it to, so they fill the gap with a bunch of feature requests. And I think in the B2B space, it's really important to make sure that your customers have a sense of where you're going in your product. It doesn't have to be super detailed about what features you're going to build, but at a minimum, hey, these are the different sort of value drivers that we're hoping to get to that are going to benefit you in the next 2 or 3 years. Do you agree with these? Are there any missing? Would you change the order of them? I don't even want to talk about features. I just want to talk about what problems do you want us to solve for you and in what order? And that's a really good starting point there.
Thanks, Rajesh. That was awesome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, I'm going rapid fire here. What's the purpose of having constituent parts? Dalen, I'm going to come back to this, and hopefully as you start identifying as you see another example during the chuck wagon, let me know if you still have a question on why the idea of having constituent parts. There's a few different examples of outcome pyramids that might help clarify the idea of breaking it down into its constituent parts. For those of you who have ever heard of like value driver trees, it's the exact same concept. Instead of like sideways, the pyramid goes up and down. It basically is the sort of leading indicators of internal KPIs, and well, it's like kind of like the math equation that unfolds behind the scenes for how the KPIs are calculated. But it's a great question, and I'll make sure I come back to him. I guess, Dylan, the one thing I would say is the reason that product usage metrics are not always connected to key outcomes is that if you were going to go ask an individual customer what success meant to them or how they would know if the product was delivering value, how many of them would say, well, I really want to just log into your product and click on this feature like every single day or every single week, right? Like product usage is not always the proxy for value creation. In fact, if you work in a world where you're trying to save time and energy, asking your customers and your users to log into your product regularly might go against what they're trying to do, which is save time, right? So that's one of the reasons why we actually parse out what the customer is trying to accomplish from the product usage metrics. Obviously, you have to connect the dots at some point, and you have to have some product usage. Nobody like just gets value out of a product that they never interact with, but that's one of the reasons why we separate and ask teams to think about this relationship. Okay, Malika, how do you balance that with continuing?
Sorry, maybe I should just
no, this is great. Actually,
that easier. Yeah, so the question is basically about when you get to the point of requiring growth, right, or building product for growth. So for me, that is like, one of the frameworks that you used was about sort of changing the customer focus or expanding, maybe not changing. And I guess in your experience, what I wanted to test was how different do personas A and B end up being? Then do you have to really build on a set of additional features, or do you have to build out entire new products for them? And then how do you balance continuing work on persona A, because that is still your core, and probably if it's big enough, you can kind of continue to work on that and improve it.
Yeah, Malika, I think I'm going to get to this in the strategic planning and the sort of roadmap balancing. I guess the short answer is, in the example I happened to show, it sort of suggested that you were expanding from the existing persona customer base to like a kind of adjacent one. That's not always true. You might be going to a totally different set of like market areas that's like, it's brand new, right? You're going from healthcare to fintech. Well, that's like, there's a lot of new requirements that come with that. So I'll come back to this, but I think they're great questions. And I think that there is a balancing act, and I'll talk about it in the roadmap balancing section.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about strategic planning. As a reminder, we're kind of in this third step of the vision-led framework. What this is working backwards from that vision. And before I get too far into this, I just want to be super clear, because I see the word product strategy thrown out a lot, and I think it means a lot of different things. And so this is our working definition, which is that the strategy is the path to get from where you are today to realizing a vision. And if I were going to visualize this here, this is where you're at, you're trying to cross the river. There's these stepping stones, and you might want to look at them before you just start running across. And otherwise you might end up on this gray one. And when the river starts flooding, now you're like stuck in the middle of the river with no way to go back to either shore, right? And so that's the general idea behind the strategic plans. And what we recommend is, once you have the vision, now you have a sense of like what you want your customer experience to look like at some point in the future, hopefully it's like 3 or 4 years. Start with a gap analysis. And the question to ask is, what would we need to realize our vision that we don't have now? Some of that might be things like new features. Some of it might be partnerships or channels. Some of it might be funding, right? Some of it might be sort of internal and operational tools. Some of it might be, marketing content. Some of it might be data. And these are like intended to be like, a mostly exhaustive list, but not entirely exhaustive of the types of things that you're going to find when you start looking at your vision and comparing it to what your experience looks like today. And once you have those gaps identified, now the question is, how do you sequence them in a particular order so that you can start filling it, right? Like if you were just going to go, if you had 5 of them, if you were to check the box next to all 5 of them, then hopefully you would have realized your vision. But there's always this hard question of how do you order them and sequence them in a particular way? And so some of the factors you're going to want to consider when you're filling those gaps is, funding, right? If you work at a startup, the financial situation and fundraising, your runway is an important factor to have there. Acquiring and extending a competitive edge. You might need to be building a moat along the way to stop competitors from coming into your space and sort of copying your product. I guess the example I think of here is Apple and like sort of iMessage, right? I would say iMessage is a little bit of their competitive moat, and there's something just so convenient about how iMessage works with everyone else who has Apple products, right? There's also this idea of serializing market segments. And Malika, I think this gets a little bit to your question, which is, are we going after different segments in the market? And should we parallel track this? Or in this case, the strategy might be, actually, we need to go after small and medium-sized businesses before we get to the enterprise, because the SMBs will help us identify 80% of what these businesses are looking for, and the enterprises are going to come with a whole different set of requirements, right? That would be an example of sort of serializing these market segments. You might also be serializing outcome delivery. And what this means is that if you identified a handful of outcome metrics that matter to a particular customer, you may choose to continuously deliver value. To me, the best example of this is Amazon Prime, right? I got the Amazon Prime membership because I just wanted 2-day shipping, but now they continue to deliver value in other dimensions, right? Then I got Amazon Prime Video, then they got Amazon Prime Music. And it's like, they're totally different from like ordering products and having them show up on my doorstep 2 days later, but I'm getting value and they're touching on different outcomes in my life that I care about, but they did that all within the same sort of like product, right? Another factor is resolving technology and data dependencies. So I think a good example of this is LinkedIn, right? When LinkedIn started, it took them a few years to just get people to build the professional social graph. But once they had it, then they could start monetizing it with LinkedIn Recruiter and LinkedIn Sales Navigator, right? Like things that people were willing to pay money for in a B2B context. They needed that data first. And then the last consideration is creating strategic leverage. I think of partnerships often here, and like this is kind of an outdated example, but when the iPhone first launched here in the US, they had an exclusive with a carrier, AT&T. And if you wanted an iPhone, you had to switch your service over to AT&T. And I think you think about how powerful that was to help AT&T build a moat and sort of extended competitive advantage when the iPhone first came to market. So these are some of the concepts that you would have to use in order to kind of pull into create a strategic plan. Let me dive into the balanced road mapping, because one of the things that happens is we see a lot of companies where the vision and strategy, it does take some time, and the executive team or group may sit out, spend a few months or do offsites, and they produce something, right? And everyone looks at it and says, yes, but in the meantime, the product development squads just have their head down, or they're just in firefighting mode because there's customer requests and there's bugs and there's tech debt, and they're like, that's cool, like that's really great. And so we built a balanced road mapping framework to acknowledge the fact that in the reality of the world, you probably can't dedicate 100% of your time to just like going to work on the vision. Maybe if you're an early stage startup and you don't have a product in market, or you're launching a new product and you have a dedicated team, but for most teams, it's not exactly realistic. And so that's why we created this sort of like balanced road mapping framework and the prioritization side. And as we worked with teams and thinking back to our own experience in the product space, we realized that there's kind of 3 big categories that every product team is juggling. One is innovation. And these are the big, bold changes to help make your vision a reality, right? There's different new features and overhauls and replatforming, and all these things I think fall into this category. The second is iteration. And this is some modest, kind of minor tweaks to the existing product. It might be conversion funnel optimizations, some usability issues, a small fix for a one-off customer request or something like that. That's not a big deal. And then finally, there's this big bucket of sort of operational needs, which is basically the cost of operating modern SaaS platforms these days, right? There's security, performance, uptime, technical debt, there's bugs, there's probably a bunch of internal tooling. And so, as you might imagine, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you know how much capacity should go into any of these 3 categories? And so I won't go too far into sort of the S-curves of innovation, but the general idea is that, the value of product delivers over time kind of like tapers off, and you need to constantly be thinking about what's the next generation of your product. And there's different life cycle phases, right? There's sort of this like alpha phase when you first launch the product, and then you're trying to find product market fit, and hopefully you can get it to the second phase where you start to circle around that product market fit. And then once you find it, you want to scale the product and try to get it into the hands of as many customers as possible. And then you sort of reach this mature stage where your product is sort of, the value it's creating is probably starting to plateau. And it's important to realize that you're in this stage so that you can start thinking about this next S curve and making the next round of innovation investments. And so, we have some rules of thumb, which is early on, you're probably spending a lot of time in innovation, which is like your alpha release. You're probably still wrapping up some of the features that you wanted to include in your MVP, but then you're going to start iterating a lot, and the same thing's going to continue to happen as you move into beta. You're trying to figure out where your product is getting traction. You want to iterate fast on the feedback that you are getting from the market so that you can be responsive and find that product market fit. And then once you do, then most of your investment goes into scalability and the operational side. Oh shoot, how are we going to handle this many users? How are we going to handle like this sort of like data volumes and the performance issues that are going to come with having this much data? How do we deal with the security requirements that come with having lots and lots of people's into people's data? And then finally, you land up in this mature phase, and you might think that you kind of move back into more iteration and operation mode. But as you kind of see from the S curve, this is when you need to start reinvesting and thinking about what the next generation of the product or the next product launch is to continuously deliver value to your customers and your business. Joseph, your question around proactive versus reactive, maybe I would say that some of the iteration probably falls a little bit more into the reactive. Like that's usually where you're trying to respond to feedback that you're getting after you've released a version or a feature of your product, right? So I'd say iteration might fall a little bit more into reactive, and maybe innovation does fall a little bit more into proactive. And the last thing I'll say about balanced road mapping is the reason that we find it helpful to categorize these things is that when we've seen a lot of product managers try to stack rank a new feature against a piece of tech debt, against a bug, against a usability issue, and it's like apples and oranges, right? So the idea is that within each category you can prioritize, and by doing a top-down allocation and getting alignment on what percentage of product development capacity should go into these different buckets, you can start stack ranking things before and that way you don't have to have discussion around what you're going to build, but instead, what are the categories of things and how are we going to spend our most valuable resource, which is our product development capacity, right? So within innovation, you should be able to pull directly from the strategic plan and its new features. Within iteration, we like a framework like RICE, which is like reach times impact times confidence divided by effort, as a super lightweight kind of scorecard prioritization framework. And then similarly for operational, but thinking about the operational metrics for which you would prioritize using a scorecard, framework like RICE. It might be performance, security, quality, risk. There might be various metrics. So that's sort of the concept behind balanced road mapping. I'll pause again and just see if there's any additional questions on connecting the dots between the long-term vision, the strategic plan, which is sort of like basically a multi-year roadmap, and then the roadmap balancing framework that allows you to sort of like decide what percentage of the next 12 or 18 months is going to go towards long-term goals versus like near-term move the needle fast, quick win type things.
I don't know if I'm taking up too much time with the question. Sorry, guys, but loving this framework, Rajesh. It's really great. My question is, you've not mentioned a framework for the first one. And in some of our recent efforts, I think we've tried to do something like a RICE for the first one, because we pull it, but then you still got to decide how big it's going to be, how much effort it's going to take, and how much confidence that you have. And I think what ends up happening is usually those future forward innovations have low confidence, right? Or that can be the case. How do you, is there a different framework you should use for that first one?
Yeah, well, I guess knowing, so this was designed explicitly knowing that in our process, you would have already defined the vision, and hopefully you validated that vision and got buy-in on the big picture things that you should be doing for your customers going into the future. And if so, then it should be relatively straightforward to pull things off of that list and say, okay, we said this is the end state, and we also came up with a strategic plan, and therefore we're going to just like kind of pull the major things off of the strategic plan that are in the time horizon in which, you know, where we're at. What I would say though is sometimes you may just say we're in discovery mode and there's nothing to be built in this innovation category because we still need to go figure out what is the most game-changing thing that we could do for our customers and our business or the market, and that takes a long time. It's not easy. It is nothing like a usability test where you show them something concrete and they have like, you know, 2 pieces of very like specific feedback, and you could take those and convert them into tickets and decide how to like go fix them, right? This is big picture stuff, and you might have to break into a world where they can't even imagine a solution to something that they do have a problem with today because nobody's doing it for them, right? And so I think that this takes a little bit of time and probably requires like a whole side chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Okay, I know we have 10 minutes and I know I'm talking fast. Like I said, I will stick around afterwards, but let me bring it all home. I do my best to make sure that nothing ever feels like sort of a product lecture. And so let me bring it back to the real world. And just so you know, this was a fake fake product that we created just for illustrative purposes. It is a B2C product, and it's intentionally a B2C product so that it's easy to grasp and it helps demonstrate some of the concepts. So let me ask a quick question. How many of y'all cook at home? Okay. All right, good. Lots and lots of you. Okay, Chuckwagon is for you. In doing the customer discovery, the team at Chuckwagon realized that one of the biggest pain points in cooking at home is that it takes a lot of time. And so what they realized is that consumers really wanted to move the needle on this key outcome, which is how much time it takes to spend on getting a home cooked meal on the table. Well, let's break down time spent into its constituent parts. There's time that you spend planning the meals, and then there's time that you spend actually making them. And if you break planning time down, there's probably some time spent trying to figure out what you're going to make. And then there's time spent getting the ingredients to go make those dishes or those meals, right? If you break the meal plan down, you're probably going to, I don't know, my wife does this like every week. She drafts it and then we look at it together and we're like, well, we had this last week. Oh, wait, I don't want to make that this week. It doesn't sound good to me anymore, right? So you got to finalize it. And then to get the groceries, you got to get to the grocery store, you got to go through the grocery store and check out. And that's a decent amount of time. On the meal creation time, you're going to spend a lot of time cooking, and then you got to clean up afterwards. I wish you could just leave the stuff there. And cooking time, you know, there's prep time, you got to cut the vegetables and go measure all the ingredients. And then there's cooking time, you got to put it in the pan or the oven or whatever. And then the cleanup, break that down into like thinking about the cooking area time and the dishes time. So this was the key outcome metric that the Chuckwagon team landed on. And so as a part of their vision artifact, they did a lot of customer discovery and realized that this is the vision that they wanted to set for their company, for their product, and for their team to know. So it's going to go through the 6 chapters of the customer journey vision. Here's the triggering moment. Sharon is a working mom. She's got 45 minutes at the end of a long day of work, try to figure out what to make for dinner for her family. And she spends a bunch of time looking through cookbooks and recipes online and just can't figure anything. And now it's urgent. Some kid is on the sofa yelling, "Mom, what's for dinner?" Right? So Sharon gets frustrated and she's like, man, there must be a better way. So she searches on Pinterest and she sees an ad for a meal planning app. And she sees some pretty good testimonials. And so she does some further evaluation. She goes to the website, she goes to the app store, she sees this got insanely good 4.9 star reviews. And so she decides that she's going to give it a try. So in the trial chapter, she sets up her family's profile, and almost instantly she's able to pick a meal that looks pretty good to her, and she makes it. She thought it was actually a pretty easy meal to make, and it smelled really good while she was making it. She put it on the table and everyone loved it. A great first time experience. So as Sharon moves on, she realizes that they offer grocery delivery, and she's like, oh, that's kind of convenient. Now I don't have to get the groceries for all these meals. So she tries that out one time, and she realized that she loves saving, an hour and a half or 2 hours every Sunday from not having to go to the grocery store. Later, she realizes that Chuckwagon also offers the option to have a chef come and make all the meals on your meal plan from the app in your house on a Sunday. And so she has a dinner party, and so she decides that she's going to go try out the chef, and she loves it. In the retention chapter, the Chuckwagon team noticed that Sharon goes on vacation and she hasn't used the product in 10 days. And so they email her and find out what's going on. Come to find out that she was just on vacation. And so they suggest and automatically set up her meal plan for when she gets back. And she loves the choices that they made for her. So this is hopefully you can understand when we said comic strip, hopefully in the 30 seconds or 2 minutes that I took to explain it, you can start digesting this. Now I'm going to layer on this sort of like mock-ups, right? And so we had our designers come work through this, and here's some mock-ups of what this experience can look like, right? Here's the household. With a single tap, there's a meal plan that loads, and boom, all the meals for the upcoming week are sort of preloaded, and you can remove them or replace them. And this is how the meal plan gets finalized. Then there's grocery delivery. There's a button that converts meal plans into a grocery list, and it stars the things that you've recently purchased because it already knows what you might have in your pantry or your fridge from last week. It gives you the ability to check the boxes while you're at the grocery store to make sure you don't forget any of the ingredients. And then later they add online grocery delivery, right? So you can link your accounts, and boom, all this stuff is just going to show up at your doorstep in a couple hours. Finally, here's the call to action for getting a chef. While you're waiting for your groceries, there's a nice little ad, and it's like, by the way, did you know you can actually book a chef to come make all this stuff for you and save even more time? And you can find a chef and pick a time for that person to show up, and there you are. So again, hopefully the visualizations, it's not just the comic strip. Now the visuals help provide clarity to avoid ambiguity and create questions and spark the questions from the team, right? So let's go look at the vision and the strategy for Chuckwagon. And I see maybe some chats coming through. You need this, yes. I did design this a little bit on my own. Okay, so Chuckwagon's vision, basically to save Americans millions of hours in deciding what to cook, buying groceries, and preparing high quality home cooked meals. Their first milestone, it's all about saving time around meal planning. And so the feature set is the one-tap personalized meal. They are trying to bootstrap, and so they want to demonstrate consumer demand for this. And so they're going to charge a monthly subscription. They're hoping to hit 2 million ARR. With a monthly subscription. Milestone 2 is when they layer on the grocery delivery service. And so then they're going to try to hit 10 million ARR and half and half between the subscriptions and the grocery delivery fees. Now they're saving time on grocery shopping. Finally, they're going to hit a third milestone, 50 million ARR. This all comes from chefs. Now that's the new revenue stream. And the reason that there's revenue stream exists is that you're saving the customers time on cooking and cleaning. If I was going to think about this sort of strategic planning though, here's the question: why didn't you just start with the chefs? You probably could have made a lot more money, and it's something kind of differentiated. No one really has this out there. There's a lot of meal planning apps out there. Well, guess what? Think about the operational side of having like an infinite number of chefs in any city go make any single recipe in the world. Well, wouldn't it be way better if the chefs only had to make a finite number of recipes and you had like a small number of choices and expertise or dishes that the chefs needed to learn how to make? That's the reason why the recipe planning came first before the chefs. Now, the other question might be, why not grocery delivery and do that at the same time as recipe plans? Well, you can't go to the grocery delivery services and say, hey, I've got 35 people in Austin, Texas using my app. Do you want to do an integration with me? You needed to demonstrate consumer grade scale that made it interesting for them, right? To want to do the integration, to build the partnership. That's why the grocery delivery service ended up being the second thing. And so this is an example of sort of like pulling together all the vision and the strategy and thinking about the sequencing of different strategic milestones. And I know I only have a minute left, so let me just show the example of a roadmap that shows the road balancing categories. So in this case, you can kind of see that there's about 60% of time that's dedicated to the alpha release of Chuckwagon. You can see the jobs to be done. You can see that there's some percentage of time, 20% dedicated to iteration. And you can see that there's some buffer. Hey, we don't even know what the iteration feedback is going to be, but we know we need to do some. And then finally, some operational buckets. And you can see here that it's about quality and, processing credit card statements and things like that. So, let me pause here and just see if there's any questions about the Chuckwagon example. I know we're at time and people might need to drop. So sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but like I said, happy to stick around for a few more minutes for anyone who wants to stay.
I guess there's one question, Rajesh, which is about.
Yeah, the SEO one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't get to cover this, but the SEO outcome, increase, SEO, SOV, or increase organic traffic, that's a business outcome, right? No individual customer cares about SEO. That's an internal metric. And so one of the ideas we actually do when we talk about key outcome pyramids is there's a one-to-one relationship between personas and key outcomes. And so every business needs at least two outcome pyramids. One is for the user or the customer, and one is for the business. And obviously you need to find the overlap between the two, right? Because if there's not, you're gonna have a hard time building a business. And so I think that the SEO ones is more, to me, an indication of progress on the discovery chapter, which is like, hey, it is really important for us to be like the number 1 or 2 Google search result, because that is our acquisition strategy. And in order to get there, for sure, the marketing team needs to do some amazing things. But that's one of the sort of like ideas about having a strategic plan like this, is that over time, it becomes a rallying artifact that product, sales, marketing, customer success can all use, because they might own different chapters of the customer journey, and they might need to have to do their own. They have their own roadmaps, right? Not everything is just product owning different parts of the customer experience. So that's the idea behind this.
Yeah, why don't we, looks like there are not many questions out there, but let me just wrap this up, and then we'll still hang out to see if there are
sounds good.
Conversations around this. By the way, I'm getting pinged a lot privately saying that can we have the video of this session, and people are just loving it. You can just see from the comments that's just pouring in. So it's a really great session. So thank you, Rajesh, on behalf of Hard Things about product community. This was super insightful and engaging. Every time I listen to you or I have a chat with you, there's something new that I keep learning. So I hope everyone had a good time learning about crafting product vision based on customer outcomes. For me, I felt like that's a really great bridge that nobody has ever done, that Rajesh was able to create along with Ben Foster, who's the co-author of the book. So book is a must read, and I really love it. So please grab a copy if you could. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to hang out a bit more, so feel free to stay and chat with us if you'd like to. Thank you.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, I will definitely send out the deck, because the deck had a lot of links. And so there were some blog posts where there's some additional context. And then like I just flashed on the screen, there's a couple of links if you just want to read more about the framework overall, and then a link to the book if you want to buy it.
I was just thinking, what about the, your well-crafted Excel, is that publicly available? How is that?
Yeah, so again, we wanted to make sure the book didn't read like a textbook. So we built a bunch of worksheets and templates and guides that went along with every single chapter. So in the road mapping chapter, there's a whole Excel, that the sort of thing that I showed at the very end with the Chuck Wagon roadmap. There's a whole Excel or Google Sheet template where you can just copy and paste that. And all of those things are publicly available. You just have to go to a page and like enter your email address, and the link will just go straight to you to a Google Doc that has it probably has 20 or 25 different templates and worksheets in it.
Thanks, Rajesh. Maybe I'll take the link from you and post it later into the community, or just go out and access this. Any other questions? Anybody? Any thoughts? Yeah, I really like the mock-up idea, by the way. Just taking this and then, kind of then it becomes super real to people eventually, and they can visualize what's going to come through.
Is that a common thing, Rajesh? Don't you need, what kind of skills do you need to be able to do that really well?
I mean, yeah, you probably need a designer to get to that level of fidelity, but you might be able to start as a product person on a napkin with a pen or something to sketch out like some rough passes of it. And you can imagine how you'd want to do that as a way of sort of like validating the sort of like end state. I think there's a balancing act as well. You want the vision to be inspiring and clear, but not so concrete that there's like no wiggle room and new ideas can't come in and sort of like, tweak or morph the general direction a little bit. But the reason that the mockups are helpful is just that like now there's something very concrete for someone to react to, which is like, wait a minute, where is this other thing that I thought would definitely be part of our longer term vision, and I don't see it at all on this screen. And now you have more meaning. It's the trigger that kicks off meaningful discussions and debates to make sure that you can get the alignment right, but there's something concrete and tangible for people to react to.
Yeah, Rajesh, I don't know if I've ever shared with you about the TurboTax one. Not sure we discussed about this, but TurboTax had this. So the problem there is that people end up 5 to 6 hours filing their taxes, right from collecting various documents to just entering it. And they came up with this vision statement of taxes are done, which is like internally measured by the thing that it's like 15 minutes you want to just probably get your taxes in, get done with, because nobody likes doing taxes as an activity. But that was like far out. I mean, we were at 4 to 5 hours, and 15 minutes is just like a multi-year journey. Yeah, so it was a bit of contrast to something what what we saw today, which is far more near and actionable.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think the thing that's interesting to me about that example is what was durable was the customer success metric, right? No one is ever going to complain about convenience or time savings. And I think if you read about how Jeff Bezos thinks about product strategy, he never wants to know what are the market trends I should know about that we should factor into our future plans. He says, tell me about the things that are not going to change. And Amazon's entire strategy is built around the fact that no one's going to complain about lower prices, better selection, and faster delivery, right? And that's how they like thought about building the entire e-commerce business, and it got them, lasted for decades, and it's still going.
True that.
May I ask a question? I think it's a little bit related to the SEO team. So let's say you have a vision that you set up that I think would be probably focused more on innovation. But then there would be operational team, or like the operational team, or iteration team. They would ask a question about what's my role in that grand vision, and what's the best way to communicate it? Because I think it's very related to the key outcome questions that was raised before.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think that org structure is a whole nother topic. And I think, I'd probably pause and ask some questions about what it means to set up an innovation team versus sort of an iteration and operation team. You can imagine how a lot of people might want to be on the innovation team just because it sounds cool and exciting. So I think what I would probably imagine if you did set it up that way is talking about the importance of like retaining the existing customer base. And like, look, there are some people, and I would say that for people who are just starting out in their product management career, they typically only work on iteration or operational things, right? Because what you're learning is how to ship great product early on in your product career. And there's no better place when you don't have to make really big picture decisions. And like, you're just kind of like trying to like zoom in, execute, work with design, work with engineering, like ship changes, measure the results, see if it's working, and those types of things. And so I think that, if you have an organization that's big enough to support 3 different teams, then you probably also have an org structure that has sort of like, a career path and career progression that might sort of enable you to do that. And so I think you can certainly make it interesting and exciting. I think on the operational side, there are a lot of like more technical product folks who love the performance and security and like those types of problem spaces, right? And love thinking about how would we support whatever 1,000, 1 million, 10 million customers on this platform and still have like a good experience for our users, right? So I think I would be thinking a little bit more about what the team dynamics are as well, and sort of communicating that type of structure. Yeah, thank you all. Really enjoyed it. I'll send the deck, and it has my email address and my LinkedIn and all that. So please get in touch if you have any questions. Happy to just chat for a few minutes or provide some guidance. If you have a question, there's a pretty good chance that one of our clients has already had it, and I probably have like a worksheet or a template I can point you to. So definitely reach out.
Thanks, Rajesh.
Thanks,
Yeah.
that was fantastic.